I stood in the bank expecting to deposit my grandmother's legacy, but within minutes my life was being dismantled by a stranger who knew exactly who my husband really was. Before the day ended, my face was plastered across the city's billboards as a target in a national manhunt, and I realized our entire reality was a carefully constructed lie. The lobby of First National was cold, a sterile, marble-lined cavern that smelled of floor wax and indifference. I stood in line, clutching my grandmother's legacy, a check that represented the final settlement of her estate. It was a substantial amount, enough to clear my student loans and finally put a down payment on a house for Marcus and me. I'd been working double shifts at the hospital for months, and today was finally the day I could stop drowning in the overhead of our lives. When it was my turn, I approached the window. The teller, a woman named Brenda, whose name tag sat crookedly on her blazer, didn't even look up as she adjusted her glasses. Her movements were sharp, dismissive. When she finally flicked her gaze toward me, her expression curdled. She didn't see a customer. She saw an inconvenience. I pushed the check forward with a polite smile, but she barely touched the paper before her eyebrows shot up. "I'm going to need to see some secondary identification for this," she said, her voice dripping with a manufactured, icy professionalism. "Of course," I replied, pulling my passport from my bag. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" She stared at the check, then at me, then back at the check. "This account is flagged for secondary review," she muttered, her fingers dancing over her keyboard with unnecessary force. She wasn't reviewing anything. She was stalling. I watched as her eyes darted to the lobby entrance, then back to the security guard standing near the door. It felt like the air in the room had shifted, thickening into something hostile. "Look, ma'am, I have the death certificate and the executor documents right here," I said, my voice steadying despite the rising heat in my chest. "Everything is in order." Brenda leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that everyone in the line could hear. "People like you tend to get creative with these kinds of documents. I'm going to have to confiscate this until the authorities verify the source. We don't just hand out money based on bits of paper people drag in off the street." My heart hammered against my ribs. "People like me? What is that supposed to mean? I have the legal right to deposit this." "You have the right to leave," she snapped, and before I could stop her, she picked up the check and shredded it into thin, confetti-like ribbons. My breath hitched. That wasn't just paper. It was my grandmother's life's work. It was my future. I leaned over the counter, my hands trembling. "You have no idea what you just did," I whispered, tears of pure, unadulterated rage stinging my eyes. She smirked, signaling the security guard to approach. "I'm protecting this institution from fraud. Move along, or I'll have you removed for causing a disturbance." I looked at the shredded remnants of my check, then at her smug, satisfied expression. I turned away, humiliated and shaking, walking toward the glass doors that led out into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. I needed air. I needed to call Marcus. As I stepped out onto the sidewalk, I reached for my phone, but my eyes caught movement on the massive digital billboard across the street. It was a new advertisement, a sleek, high-profile campaign for the city's upcoming charity gala. My hand froze. My blood turned to ice in my veins. The billboard featured a portrait of a man in a tuxedo, smiling warmly. It was Marcus, but the text beneath his photo didn't say "local architect" or "charity donor" like it usually did. It was plastered with bold crimson letters that sent a jolt of terror through my entire body. It read, "Wanted, subject of a national investigation, suspected involvement in an organized scheme. Do not approach." I stood paralyzed on the sidewalk, the roar of the city traffic fading into a dull, rhythmic thrumming in my ears. I looked back at the bank, then at the billboard, then down at my phone as it buzzed in my hand. It was a text from an unknown number. It read, "They know about the contents of the safe. Run." The world didn't stop moving. The buses still lumbered down the street. People still hurried past me with their coffee cups. But my reality had shattered. I stared at the screen, the glowing text burning into my retinas. Run. My mind raced through the last 3 years of our marriage. Marcus was an architect, a man of blueprints and precise measurements. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't part of some shadowy, organized scheme. Yet there he was, his face towering over the city center, labeled with that terrifying accusation. I tucked my phone into my pocket, my fingers shaking so hard I could barely grasp it. I couldn't go back into the bank, and I certainly couldn't stay on this sidewalk. If the authorities were looking for Marcus, they were likely looking for anyone associated with him. My mind flashed to our home, the house he'd surprised me with, the basement office he kept locked even from me. I had always assumed he was just protective of his sensitive designs. Now, the weight of his secrecy felt like a physical burden. I started walking, then transitioned into a desperate, frantic jog. Every passing car felt like a potential threat. Every siren in the distance sounded like it was closing in on me. I reached our apartment building, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't use the elevator. I took the stairs 2 at a time, needing to get inside and lock the world out. When I fumbled with the key, the door swung open before I could even turn the lock. Marcus was standing in the foyer, his suit jacket discarded on the floor, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked frantic, packing a duffel bag with a chilling efficiency I'd never seen before. When he saw me, his face softened for a fraction of a second, then tightened into a mask of pure panic. "Elena," he breathed, stepping toward me. "You're home early. You saw the billboard." "What is going on, Marcus?" I screamed, the hysteria finally breaking through. "Why does the city think you're involved in an organized scheme? Why are they calling it a national investigation? Tell me the truth, or I swear I'm calling the Service of Internal Security right now." He grabbed my shoulders, his grip almost bruising. "Listen to me very carefully. That bank teller today, she wasn't just a racist. She was part of the surveillance team. They weren't checking your credentials. They were waiting to see if you would try to access the offshore accounts. The bank is a front, Elena. It's a hub for a global network that hides money behind a facade of legitimacy." My head swam. "I don't care about the bank. Who are you?" "I'm a whistleblower," he hissed, his eyes darting to the window. "I found the digital trail. I have the evidence of their entire organized scheme hidden in the floorboards of the study. But they have eyes everywhere. They have people in the police, in the banks, in the government. The billboard? That was a threat. They're framing me for a heavy criminal charge to discredit me before I can leak the data to the press." I pushed him away, stumbling back. "You're lying. You're just like them. You dragged me into this." "I did this to protect us," he shouted, then stopped abruptly, his head tilting toward the hallway, his face drained of color. He reached into his waistband and pulled out a heavy object, an illegal weapon he'd never mentioned owning. The sight of it felt like a gunshot to my stomach. "They're here," he whispered, killing the lights in the room. We stood in the suffocating darkness of the living room. Seconds later, the sound of heavy, rhythmic thuds echoed in the hallway. Boots, purposeful and professional. Then the silence was broken by the sound of the metal lock on our front door being sheared off by a high-powered drill. The door creaked open, casting a sliver of light into our darkness, and I realized with a jolt of pure terror that the shadow standing on the other side of the threshold wasn't the police. It was the security guard from the bank. And he wasn't alone. The hallway was bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the apartment building's emergency lighting, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched toward us like grasping fingers. The bank security guard stood in the frame, but he looked different now. The uniform was gone, replaced by tactical gear that looked far too expensive for a man who spent his days standing behind a velvet rope. He didn't look like a guard. He looked like a soldier in an undeclared war. Behind him, two other men emerged, their faces obscured by the dim lighting, their movements synchronized and lethal. Marcus pressed a heavy finger to his lips, his eyes locked on the door. He shoved me toward the back exit, the emergency fire stairs that I had never bothered to notice until this moment. "Run, Elena," he whispered, his voice trembling with a raw, desperate intensity. "Take the hard drive from the study floorboard. If they get that, the truth about the organized scheme dies, and we go down for an attempt to break our lives with a false criminal accusation. Go." "I'm not leaving you," I hissed, clutching his sleeve, but he shook me off with a strength I hadn't realized he possessed. "If you stay, we both die," he said, and for the first time I saw the truth of his terror. He wasn't the mastermind of some grand plot. He was a man who had stumbled into a hornet's nest and was trying to shield me from the sting. He didn't wait for my agreement. He turned, raised the illegal weapon, and fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The deafening crack shattered the silence of the apartment, sending the intruders ducking back into the hall. In that split second of confusion, I bolted. I sprinted into the study, the room where Marcus spent his late nights, the room where I had always respected his privacy, as if it were a temple. Now it was just a crime scene waiting to happen. I dropped to my knees, clawing at the rug, until I found the loose floorboard Marcus had mentioned. My fingernails splintered, but I didn't care. I pried the wood up, revealing a small steel lockbox. I grabbed it, the weight of it feeling like a lead anchor in my palm. As I stood up, the apartment door was kicked inward with the force of a battering ram. The sound of splintering wood and metal echoed through the small home, followed by the cold, clipped commands of men who were clearly trained for tactical entry. "Clear the sector," one of them barked. "No witnesses. Keep the asset intact." I scrambled toward the fire escape, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might bruise my lungs. I reached the window, pushed it open, and felt the humid night air hit my face. I looked back one last time. Marcus was pinned behind the kitchen island, firing back, his movements desperate but calculated. He saw me at the window, and for a fleeting moment, our eyes met. He didn't look like a criminal then. He looked like a man saying goodbye to everything he had ever loved. I climbed out onto the metal grating of the fire escape, the iron biting into my hands. Below me the alley was dark, save for the flickering glow of a single streetlight. I started to descend, my footsteps echoing against the metal, but as I reached the second landing, I stopped dead, blocking the base of the fire escape. Standing perfectly still in the shadows was Brenda, the bank teller. She wasn't wearing her blazer anymore. She was dressed in a dark tactical jumpsuit, and she held a suppression-equipped pistol aimed directly at my chest. The look on her face wasn't one of professional resentment anymore. It was cold, predatory, and satisfied. "You were always the weak link, Elena," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of any human warmth. "Marcus told us you were oblivious, but you just couldn't help but play detective, could you? Give me the box, and maybe I'll make sure your death is quick." I clutched the steel box to my chest, my legs shaking. There was nowhere to go. Up was death. Down was Brenda. I scanned the alley for an exit, but the heavy steel gate at the end of the passage was chained shut. I was trapped. Suddenly a loud mechanical hum echoed from above. A black drone buzzing with the sound of a swarm of wasps descended from the rooftop, its camera lens glowing a vibrant, menacing red. It hovered inches from my face, scanning my retinas, and then a digitized, gravelly voice broadcast from the device. "Subject identified. Asset acquisition initiated. Neutralize the civilian." Brenda smiled, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Last chance, Elena. The box." The metallic click of Brenda's pistol being toggled to full fire was the loudest sound I had ever heard. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but as I stared into the red, unblinking eye of the hovering drone, something in me snapped. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the icy, searing clarity of a cornered animal. If this was the end, I wasn't going to die holding a box of secrets that could dismantle their entire organized scheme. I was going to use it. I didn't hand her the box. Instead, I whipped it around and hurled it not at her, but directly into the spinning blades of the drone. The impact was violent. Metal shrieked against plastic as the lockbox shattered the drone's rotors. The device spun out of control, careening into the brick wall of the alley in a shower of sparks and blackened circuitry. The explosion of debris caught Brenda off guard, forcing her to raise her arms to shield her face. That split second was all I needed. I dove off the fire escape, landing hard in a pile of discarded industrial trash bags. The air left my lungs, but I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my ankle. I didn't run away from the danger. I ran toward the main thoroughfare. I knew that if I could get to a place with cameras, a place where the public could see me, their neutralization plan would become too high profile to execute. I burst out of the alleyway and onto the main boulevard just as the neon signs were beginning to flicker to life. A police patrol car was idling at a red light not 50 feet away. I didn't think. I sprinted toward it, screaming, and slammed my hands against the hood. The officers jumped, their hands flying to their holsters, but I didn't give them a chance to interpret me as a threat. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the one thing I had managed to grab from the box before the drone hit, a small, ruggedized memory drive, and held it up like a beacon. "I have the evidence," I shrieked, my voice cracking. "The organized scheme, the bank, they're trying to kill me." The officers were confused, but the sudden screech of tires behind me changed everything. Brenda had emerged from the alley, her tactical gear now partially visible beneath a trench coat, a suppressed weapon leveled at me. The police officers saw the threat immediately. They didn't hesitate. They tackled her before she could get off a single shot, their shouts filling the air as they swarmed her. The next 24 hours were a blur of blinding interrogation lights and cold, sterile rooms. But this time, it wasn't the bank's private security. It was the Internal Oversight Committee, the only branch of the government that hadn't been compromised by the network. They took the drive, they listened to the files, and they watched the footage of the raid on our home. Marcus was found an hour later, bloodied and beaten, but alive, hidden in the crawl space he had prepared for this exact moment. We were reunited in a secure facility, miles away from the city, under the protection of a witness security detail. The bank's facade crumbled within days. The investigation that had been plastered on the billboards wasn't dropped. It was turned around. The Internal Oversight Committee used the data to expose the entire network, leading to the arrest of dozens of high-ranking officials who had been laundering funds through that branch. Brenda, the woman who had shredded my grandmother's check with such callous entitlement, didn't get away with it. She and her associates were hit with massive charges, not for the petty crimes they thought they were committing, but for their involvement in a massive coordinated attempt to break the legal system. The judge didn't show mercy. The sentences were gargantuan, ensuring they would spend their remaining decades in a concrete box, far away from the power they had so ruthlessly abused. Months later, Marcus and I sat on the porch of a small, quiet cottage in a state no one would ever think to look for us. The morning sun was warm, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to look over my shoulder. We had lost everything: our home, our past, our old identities. But we had gained something far more valuable. We had gained the truth. I looked down at my hands. They were scarred, but they were steady. I walked to the edge of the porch and took a deep breath, the scent of pine and wild grass filling my lungs. The check from my grandmother's estate had been destroyed, a casualty of a war I never asked to fight, but it didn't matter anymore. We were free. And as I watched Marcus come around the corner with 2 mugs of coffee, smiling that same warm, gentle smile, I knew that no amount of money could have bought the peace we had finally earned. The billboard was gone, the network was broken, and for the first time, our future wasn't written in someone else's ledger. It was ours to build.